So we're going to get started. Passed around the sign-in sheet, so please sign in. I'll be looking over the test this week to see how everyone did, and so we'll see how you did. Hopefully, 100% all the way around. But if not, we'll see. So we're now entering I know it's very sad because we're entering the last section of the course. I know that I didn't bring any tissues. Perhaps I should have, because I know it's going to be a sad day come end of April, early May, when we have to say goodbye. But we still have time. The good news is we still have about 5 to 6 weeks together. So have bravery and be ready to go. Okay, so we are now entering the final section. That means chapters 11 through 15 is what we are assigned to cover during this last few weeks. Okay? So remember that. I want to remind you, I am going to have a party at my house April 21st, which is a Friday evening. Let me double check that date. I think it's April the 21st. Somewhere I've got a calendar here. Yes, I do. Yes, April the 23rd, first at my house. You can come starting at 5:30 and stay, I guess, as long as you like. And I'll be making pizzas. I make the dough myself. I let it rise for a couple of days in the refrigerator. Then I make each pizza. I have stones in my oven and a big paddle, and I make my own sauce, and so you can have a pizza somewhat custom made. I only have so many toppings. I give a bunch of toppings, but then people never want them, is what I've found. Once you go past the tomato sauce, the cheese, maybe the pepperoni, I put peppers and other stuff, and people, I don't want peppers, I don't want vegetables, I don't want this to be good for me. So, mushrooms, stuff like that, people haven't really wanted. So, anyway, I'll have some toppings that you can I can sort of customize it. And usually when I pull it out of the oven and I put it out there and cut it, by the time I turn back around, it's usually gone. So I guess that means people like it. So, but there will be other things besides pizza if you are pizza averse, which is not too many people. There will be other things to eat. So you really don't have to bring anything, just yourself. I can give you directions. You might want to carpool because some people don't have vehicles or may not know their way around. But anyway, I just want to let you know you are invited. And, you can just come and eat and stay for an hour or so and leave if you have something else going on. That's why I'm starting at 5:30. Give people time. I know my parties aren't that exciting, so you have to go somewhere else afterwards to really have fun. But you can at least come to my house for a little while. Okay. I do have a pool, but I don't think you'll want to swim. Maybe it'll be warm enough. I don't know. It's up to you. Certainly, that is an option if you'd like to swim. There is a pool, so it's not heated, however, so bear that in mind. Depends on how. I don't know if there'll be any free books this time. I think I've given most of my books away. Last party, I gave away books to everybody that wanted them, but I think now I'm going to have to reserve the rest of them for me. I gave away a lot of books. Maybe give you something else. Maybe file folders. I don't know. Something. All right. Well, that's enough about that. Okay. So, let's begin then. We are now on to the third and final section of this course. As you probably have noticed, at least I've noticed, I hope you've noticed by now, we do 5 chapters, we take a test. We do 5 chapters, we take a test. We're going to do another 5 chapters and take a test. So, is that a final? It's not really a final in the traditional sense of it, is that it will not be a cumulative exam. If there's an outcry from you that you want a cumulative exam, that's easy enough for me to do. We could change it. But for right now, I'm just planning on a unit exam. So basically the test will be just like the other tests we've taken. It'll be worth the same amount of points. It'll cover 5 chapters. It's just going to be the last 5 chapters. Okay? So that's what we'll do. We'll do it the same way online. Okay. Let's go ahead and begin. As we enter this last section of the course, we've just come out of talking about the High Middle Ages with growing population. We did talk about the Crusades and other things like that, but we're going to see a real change in what's happening in Europe starting around 1300. Okay, we're going to say about 1300. And for the next 150 years, let's say, we will see some real changes in what's going on. We see a decline in trade. We're going to see a decline in the amount of food that's available. We're going to see a decline in the population. Why? Well, partially it is a change in climate. It's actually getting colder at this time. And when it gets colder in a place like Europe, that means you have a shorter growing season. Here in Florida, we don't worry too much about growing seasons, I guess. Mainly just rain and alligators we have to worry about. But not growing season. We don't get much frost around here. Very rarely. But in Europe, especially France, Germany, England, so forth, frost is a very real thing. For example, I lived in Kentucky for many years, as I've told you, and I would put out a garden. I've tried to put out a small garden this year in Florida because I don't know anything about growing stuff in Florida, so I'm experimenting. But in Kentucky, for example, you would have to put things out after the last frost. You have to be sure there was not going to be another frost. So basically the rule of thumb that they would tell everybody, and you would break it at your own risk, is to not plant your garden until after Mother's Day. Mother's Day. So in other words, plant your garden in May. Mother's Day is usually the first Sunday of May. Okay? So if you don't know that, you probably should learn that for your mother, right? Buy her something, give her something, do something for her. Wash her laundry for a change. That would really shock her. Clean her house, stuff like that. Anyway, but Mother's Day. So after Mother's Day, then you could plant. And then you could keep things going until the first frost, which, where I lived in Kentucky, was in October. Usually October, first week or two in October. So you'd have to kind of watch the weather. If you had anything else out there growing, you'd want to go pick it before the frost, right? Like peppers and tomatoes and stuff like that. So in Europe, this makes a big deal. If you start changing the weather, now you start reducing the growing time. Because I can tell you in Europe, they did not have basically from early May to mid-October. Their growing period was smaller already. And if you start cooling down the weather, they're going to have even less time. That means less food per year, less yield. And this will then bring about a famine because they didn't have enough food. Remember, their population had really mushroomed in the High Middle Ages. So they needed a high level of food just to keep everybody fed. And if you start reducing the growing season by a week, let's say, or 2 weeks, it may not seem like much, but it makes a big difference in your yield, your output at the end. A week or two can make all the difference for you making it through the winter and for having some surplus. So, the famine would then weaken the population. Famines begin around 315. They have some serious famines from 315 to 317. Now, one of the things that happens when a population is weakened, do we have anybody in here that's studying something like nursing or medicine? One? Only one? Two? Okay, good. When we get sick, we only got two of you to help us. We got 2 or 3. That's it. That's going to be a lot of work for you, which I guess you got to get used to if you're going to go into that profession. You also have to have a lot of patience, by the way. You get it? A lot of patience. Never mind. That was just for me. But you do need a lot of patience. Anyway, so the shift in the weather was a real problem, and so what we see then is by the time you get to about the 1330s and 1340s, you're going to have widespread hunger. Now, the reason I mentioned the sort of medicine, nursing kind of thing is that what tends to happen, unfortunately, is when you have a population that is weakened, they are far more likely to have other problems, right? This is what classically happens to college students. I'm sure none of you do this, but you don't sleep. You stay up all night. What I used to call goofing around. You probably don't call it that anymore. You probably have some other fancy name for it. But it's the same thing. You're just wasting a bunch of time, talking. You're probably clicking on your phones, whatever you're doing the snappity, faceity, whatever, twitty, the Twitter, the twitty, snappy, facey, googly, whatever you're doing, okay? You're doing all that stuff all night long. And whatever it is you're doing, I don't know. It's best I don't know. But anyway, you're staying up too late. And then you don't want to get up in the morning. And so you basically operate on very little amount of sleep. That's not good. It's not good for a lot of reasons. First of all, your mind just shuts down, right? Like right now, I can look out here and I can see it. It's like, most of the minds are just, it's like when you turn the television on, you see the light comes on, and then when you turn the television off, that's what I'm seeing. More like the television is going off than coming on. Anyway. So, you don't get enough sleep. When you don't get enough sleep, then you get weakened. And that means you get sick. Because you're also hanging around, all these other people, and they're all getting sick. And they're coughing on you and sneezing on you and they're whatever else, and then you go over there and, we have a lovely facilities to eat. However, you're all eating in the same place, mostly. You're sharing your drinks and your food. It's like a giant, the university campus becomes like a giant petri dish of disease. And so I don't want to make, have you eaten lunch? Hopefully you've already eaten lunch. But, what I tell people is when you go in a lunchroom like that, and, you go over and get your silverware, just think about how many other people have ever used that fork or something. Maybe don't think about it. Okay. I'm sure it's very sanitary. I'm just saying there's lots of germs out there. Some of you are germophobic. Your skin is crawling right now, but the rest of you say, well, big deal. I don't care. Okay. But anyway, this is what happens. You get weakened. They had gotten weakened, and guess what? They start getting a disease, a terrible disease, a disease which they had never faced before. This is what happens when a disease comes into a population that has never faced it before. It decimates the population. All right? Perhaps you've heard that, for example, some Native American areas, when they would get, say, measles or mumps or some other kind of thing would come in, it would just go through and really devastate the population. It's because they'd never been exposed to it before. This disease had never been in Europe before. At least we have no evidence it was ever there before. And so when it comes in, what does that mean? No one is immune to it. No one's ever even experienced it. There's no antibodies. There's no antigens. There's nothing that's really there to fight. Now, some people naturally can fight it, but a lot of people cannot. It's called the Black Death. It's called the bubonic plague. So it has different names. Why is it called the Black Death? Because people, when they would get this disease, those of you who've studied the medicine, you've heard of the lymphatic system. Have you heard of the lymphatic system? If you haven't, you will. I hope you will. Lymphatic system, which fights infections and things. There are lymph nodes that are part of the lymphatic system. The lymph nodes are typically in the groin area under your arms and are put around your neck area, okay? Roughly. What happens when this disease would come is those lymph nodes would swell. They would get big bulbs. This is why it's called bubonic, because the bubonic means it causes these bulbs or bulbous swelling. Like you can see some of it on her right here. It's swelling around the neck, the groin, and the underneath your arms. Okay? What happens is it swells so much that the blood vessels rupture, and then you get a lot of bruising. Okay? And that's what gives it the dark color, the sort of black or really purple color, like you see here. That's where it gets the name the Black Death. Because once you could see that rupturing on somebody, and this disease was very fast too. You could see somebody and 4 or 5 days later they're dead. They're fine. Within a week they can die very quickly. This can happen. Okay? So this was obviously very scary for people, frightened them. It was called the Black Death. Well, they didn't know what caused it. They weren't sure. The one thing they did know is if you get around somebody that has this, you're much more likely to get it. So what do you think most people want to do? They see somebody that has these symptoms, they don't want to be around them, they don't want to touch them, they don't want to be in the same room with them, they don't want to help them. So this basically means these people who are in terrible pain and so forth, suffering, also get very little care because very people are afraid to help them. Now, we know what causes it. It's caused by rats, it's caused by fleas, it's caused by a bacteria. So how does that work? The bubonic plague then is caused by this bacteria, Yersinia pestis. You can see it here, picture of it. The bacteria is carried in a flea, a specific flea that likes to nibble on rats, especially black rats. These are Asian rats. They didn't have them in Europe before. So, how did the disease get there? It came when the rats migrated to Europe. How did the rats migrate to Europe? Yeah, go ahead. The Silk Road, very good, yes. As the Mongols, your favorite people, began to move from Asia across, well, the rats came with them. I guess, they got little SUVs, and the rats got in there and went along the same route as the Mongols, right? They got in their bags of grain, they sort of followed them from camp to camp, from place to place. And so as the Mongols moved, and then as we get the trade that comes, and we get the Silk Road, and some of that comes by ship, the rats get on the ship, the rats come in, the ship comes into the harbor, the rats get off the ship. Suddenly, you got a new kind of rat, and evidently these were tough rats. The Asian rats were kind of tough rats, and they sort of bullied the European rats around. If you're thinking of like rat gangs, the Asian rats were pretty tough. So they began to expand across Europe, and as they do, they have with them their own particular flea. The flea then and the rat are, the rat is an intermediate host for this disease. The rat doesn't get sick and die. The human is the terminal host. You kind of want to avoid that. Being the terminal host to about anything is not a good idea. So that's what happens. So the bubonic plague would come. It would spread up these trade routes, particularly the Silk Road and other trade routes related to that, things coming from Asia, including rats. and the fleas on the rats, and the bacteria in the rats, and then the fleas would bite the rats. The fleas then carried the bacteria, and then guess what? The fleas bite you. They get on you and bite you, fleas are pretty good at doing that. You don't want to. This is why you want to make sure your pet has a flea, protection. It can spread quickly throughout your house. Again, I'm just telling all kinds of nice stuff today. And then you could get in like your bed, your couch, and whatever, your carpet. You have fleas everywhere, and they're hopping all around, and they're nibbling you. So right now, if you kind of feel a little itchy, it could be a flea. Just don't think about it. That's the best thing. Just don't think about the fleas nibbling you. Okay, when they bite you then, that's how you get the bacteria. It then goes through your blood system eventually and infects your body. And if the humans then, it seriously, for most people, it can kill them pretty rapidly. Now, some people can get sick and recover from it, but a lot of people do not. Okay? What are your symptoms? Just think of me as WebMD for the bubonic plague. All right, first of all, do you have any aching joints? Maybe a little fever? A little warm? Achy? Kind of like flu-like symptoms, right? That's what usually people call it. The flu, you're kind of achy, right? And generally don't feel great. You got any swelling? You want to kind of press in here around your neck. Swelling. Hopefully not. By the way, if you have any swelling there, it doesn't necessarily mean you got the bubonic plague, but if you do, you need to go talk to somebody because you got something. Okay? You got something. By the way, today the bubonic plague is still out there. It's still out there. It's not gone. It's just we have ways of stopping it today. Because in the medieval world, they did not have all the antibiotics that we have. We have various antibiotics that can kill the bubonic plague. So people still get it. People in New York get the bubonic plague. Maybe every year. Because they got a lot of rats. And they got a lot of people. The other place where they've gotten the bubonic plague is Arizona. Anybody here from Arizona? Are you from Arizona?
Arizona.
All right, you got out there, you got these things that are called the prairie dogs?
We call them meerkats.
What do you call them?
They're not really meerkats. We just
You call
call them meerkats.
them meerkats. Well, those things get fleas, and they can carry bubonic plague. And so some people actually more in rural areas of Arizona have gotten the bubonic plague, whereas the rats are usually in urban areas. Okay? So those are two places I'm sure it happens elsewhere. But those are two places where it's still around. But if somebody is diagnosed today, it's not as serious because, it's not that it's not serious at all. It is. But you have antibiotics of various kinds that can fight it off. And typically, typically people don't die of it now. Okay? Unless they already have many other problems. But it's still out there. So we see dark blotches. That's what I'm talking about. It's like some people call it the Black Death. It gets that nickname because of the blackening of the skin, the bruising really is what it is. The black and blue part of your skin of subdermal bleeding, because basically what's happening is you're bursting the blood vessels when the lymph nodes swell. And then of course the rats carry it to the humans via the fleas. So, by the way, if you have the fleas on you and you die, guess what? The fleas don't want to stick around somebody who's dead. That's not a good meal. So they go to somebody who's alive. So if you're in the same house, it's easy for fleas to jump. They can jump a long ways. And they can jump onto you and give you the Black Death, which definitely could wreck your day. Okay. All right. Any questions about that? So that's how it arrives. You already have a weakened population, and now this disease shows up. Now remember, it originates in Central Asia. As we said, the Silk Road, right, helps to spread it. The Mongols, and they're spreading across Asia. They come from Asia and go all the way across into Russia and Europe. And then from there, other trade areas, because actually this bubonic plague hits the Middle East before it hits Europe. It does devastation in the Middle East. Lots of people dying. I went to a conference once where there was a man there who studied ancient religions. Ancient diseases. But he said he was looking at the religion of Islam, and he said that there were all kinds of records within the Islamic world of the Black Death about 10 years before it hit Europe. And nobody knew what it was. Nobody knew how to stop it. And in those cases, I remember him reading something that said all these people were dying. They didn't know what to do with them. So they put them onto boats and let them float out in the Mediterranean just to kind of tow them out there. Cut the rope, leave them out there because you did not want to be around them. Well, the climate change is also helping to push the Asian rats west. Maybe what's encouraging the Mongols to move west as well. So, By the way, our climate is always changing. There are changes, fluctuations. So I'll keep that in mind. And we have in this medieval period what's usually called a mini ice age. So that's what really reduces the food production. So they spread along those lines. Here is a little cartoon made during the Black Death. I guess it's dancing skeletons. I don't really know what it is. I'm going to call it dancing skeletons. But death was all around people. Death was all around. Now here is a map. Take a look. On this map you can see, for example, the waves, the arrows here, the black arrows that move up, and there are slightly different colors. You can see the colors on the legend to the right. Different shades of beige and tan and what do you call that? Mauve or something, I don't know. For me, there's like 4 colors, but I've noticed other people think there are more. So I try to appease them by saying different names. To me, there's like brown and red and green and blue. That's pretty much it. So you got light red, that's pink, what you guys call pink. You got dark red, you got light blue, you got dark blue. You got medium blue. But they're all blue. And black is really, not a color in this sense. It's all the colors put together, and white is sort of all the light, right? So those white and black, technically, I don't know, I guess we call them colors, but anyway, that's my problem, not yours. But you can see up here at the top, darker brown or tan, and then it gets sort of lighter, kind of a goldish color down here. And then here, this sort of mauve. I'm going to call it mauve. I call it purple. I guess I do think there's purple, so that's another one. So anyway, you see it starts in the islands down here like Sicily, and it moves up through Sardinia, and it moves to the southern part of France, and it makes its way into Italy, and then it begins just to move quickly across Europe, all the way up into Scandinavia. And notice how quickly it's doing it. Take a look at that legend there. Starting in 350, 347 to 350, just a 3-year period. From here all the way up to here. That's rapid movement. And it's moving along trade lines. It hits England. It hits Ireland. It hits Norway, Sweden, and everything in between. Everything from the Mediterranean all the way up into Scandinavia. And it's spreading very, very quickly. And it's devastating. So we see in Italy, for example, one of the first places hit, because it's in the south, it's moving south and north, because that's the way the trade's coming in. High death rates in Italy, 50 to 60% of people dying in Italy. And remember, this is just in, let's say, 3 years. So if you think about that, we take this room, we're a little sparse today. What do we got? We say maybe 30, let's say we got 30 people in here. I don't know, I'm not going to count them all. That means that half, the person either on your left or your right would be dead in a short amount of time. And there'd just be half of us left. Right? So by 1347, we see that from the Middle East, it makes its way to Sicily, the island of Sicily. It's coming on ships from Genoa, the Italian city of Genoa, because a lot of the merchant ships were Italian. This is why it hits Italy so hard and so early, because a lot of the, like Venice and Genoa and so forth, these cities had merchant fleets that would bring goods back. They were really involved in the silk trade and spice trade and things like that. And we see it then hits Italy first. Certainly by 1348, it's made it onto the boot of Italy, right? The mainland of Italy. Spreads rapidly into port cities. Venice, Genoa, Pisa. And also in 1348, it spreads quickly to the south of France and into Spain. Here you see artwork of those who are dying and those who are trying to take care of them. Notice the main people who are going to volunteer to take care of the plague victims are going to be Christians, and a lot of them are going to be monks or nuns. Okay? Because no one else would do it. And they took compassion. I mean, these people were suffering. I mean, even if you know somebody's going to die in 5 days, right? You just want to walk away and leave them there by themselves. They get thirsty. They're fevered. So they would try to relieve their pain, and then, of course, you'd have to deal with the bodies. What are you going to do with these bodies? If you've got, say, 50% of the people dying in a short amount of time, you're going to have a lot of bodies all over the place. You don't want to leave those bodies just all over the place, right? So you have to gather them up. You want to try to give them a burial, but there's so many that you have to usually bury them, put them in a large grave and put a whole bunch of them in there at once, not individual graves. Okay, so you dig a big pit, put a lot of people in there, have a funeral, cover them up. It's terrible stuff. Really is very terrible. All right, it spreads over Europe. And again, this is a very similar map showing you this line of how it's moving northward, right? Starting from the islands, moving onto the mainland, and all the way up to Scandinavia. So it's in northern Europe by 1348. It's in England by 1349. It will come into Eastern Europe. There's not as much trade into Eastern Europe. So Eastern Europe doesn't get hit as early or as hard. So they're spared quite a bit of this. Now, what's unusual about this, think about this. There are some cities and towns where the entire city or town disappears. We have records of this certainly in Germany and England. It probably happened elsewhere too. Part of it is because, let's say, maybe a large portion of the population dies, and then nobody wants to go back. Let's say you know your town, a whole bunch of people are dying. What are you going to probably do? You're probably going to try to get out of town, right? Got trouble in town, you try to get out of town. And so that's what they did. And then you decide, do you want to go back? Some people say, no, we're not going back. So what you end up with are sort of like what some people call ghost towns. Right? The buildings are there. A lot of dead bodies around. but nobody wants to go back, right? For a long time anyway, nobody wants to go back because they remember what happened and are afraid it's going to happen again. And by the way, this plague does hit again and again and again. Now, the next times that it hits, it's not as devastating as this first time. But it does repeat. So, here is the estimation. And again, we don't have hard numbers. It's hard to get hard numbers, right? It's difficult to obtain realistic numbers, but the estimates are between 25 and 50% of the population of Europe dies in about 4 years. Now think about that. So most people say over a third of the population of Europe dies in about 4 years. Now let's think about that. Think about what that would do. Think about what that would do to any population if 25 to 50% were gone. That means, the guy that used to be the baker is dead. The guy that used to work in these fields is dead. The person that used to do this or that is gone. So who's going to do that? Who knows how to do it? And how much do we need to plant? Where are the supplies? How do we do this? Imagine. There's a lot of upheaval because you're not sure if you're going to survive. You're not sure if you can cover all the bases after people leave. So, for example, the estimated population of Europe is about 75 million people. This is just a guess. Pretty good guess, I suppose. But just to give you some numbers to just try to comprehend. 75 million people, then in about 4 to 5 years, you have between 19 and 38 million people dying in Europe in 4 years. Okay? So you think about that. Let's just round it up to 40 and make it 5 years. Right? 40, 5 years. That means 8 million people, roughly, between 7 and 8 million people are dying every year. Maybe more in the beginning and less, but it's moving through geographically. It hits Italy hard, and Italy starts to recover. Well, and once it moves through like this, it doesn't mean that it's over, because it's going to come back. There's going to be waves of it. It'll resurge. So remember, this is happening, roughly around 1350, late 1340s. But in the early 1360s, you have some major outbreaks in 1361, 62, and 69. And then intermittently, you will have plague outbreaks throughout the rest of the 14th century. So that's the 1300s, and the 15th century, which is the 1400s. It could happen. So people were very afraid. Just imagine how afraid you might be. You don't know exactly how this happens. You don't have a way to stop it. All you know is that once it comes, it devastates people quickly. And if you were anywhere nearby, you could potentially get it. So it puts a lot of fear. People are surrounded with death and fear of death and sickness and loss of loved ones and so forth. Now eventually we see the brown rat fights back and kicks the black rat out. I like to think it's sort of a gang thing, but at any rate, eventually it dissipates because the rat population changes and because people build up immunity. In other words, the people who were really susceptible to it died early, and then the ones who aren't lived, and then they have children who are probably more likely to be able to fight it off. Anyway, we also see a change in the rat population. Now, Those are sort of the facts. Yes.
How do they keep track of the rat population? How is that such a minuscule detail? How do they track that?
You know, a lot of this is tracked through incidental reports. It's not somebody's going out and counting rats. But part of it is trying to figure out how it happened, and part of it is taking the accounts that we do have and extrapolating from them. Like this guy that I know who studied ancient disease. He actually works for a pharmaceutical company in England, Glasgow Wellcome, which is a huge pharmaceutical company. They hire him to study ancient diseases to look for patterns and for look to ways to maybe solve them. And so he would take things like somebody's diary where they mention something has happened, or some account that says in this town this happened, and then sometimes they might give an account of the person's symptoms, you know, and then they compare those things, all those different literary references of what the symptoms were like, and then try to do geographically where it was located, and the trends for its decline, and then they compare it with the weather patterns. So you know, as the weather starts to moderate back a little bit, yes, but this is the assumption. I wouldn't say we have anybody's out there counting it, but we do start to see that the European rat makes a resurgence. There's more of those rats around. They don't tend to carry that disease like the Asian rat. Okay? All right. Now we've talked about some of the basic facts of the disease and what it does. Now I want us to think, if we can, about the reaction to this disease. So to do this, you really have to kind of put yourself in the place of these people. Imagine yourself living in Europe, let's say 1350, 1360. You have seen the devastating effects of this disease. Most likely, many of your friends and many of your family members are now dead. Because if it's 25 to 50%, well, that means 25 to 50% of your family and friends are also dead. And it could be higher. You know, that's just the average. So, that means that your grandfather, your mother, your brother, your cousins, your friends down the road, a lot of people are dead, and you've seen them go, and you've seen them go quickly and painfully. So, what's going through your mind? And you know it could come back. It could take you or other people. It's going to start to change the way you think. Did you think it would? It's going to start to affect the way you look at life. It's going to affect the way you look at religion and philosophy and everything else. Now, people of your age, roughly, I'm generalizing, but most of you in here, I'd say, are fairly young, right? Most traditional age of college students is, like, say, 18 to 22, give or take a year or two. And then, some people stretch out that 4-year degree and they really cram it into like 6 or 7 years. So, okay, I'm taking that into account. But basically, you're in late teens, early 20s. Most people in their late teens, early 20s don't think much about death. Certainly their own death. They think they got all kinds of time. Right? I think that's what happens to old people. People are, like 40. Really old people, like 40 years old, 50 years old, like decrepit old people are going to die. But not me. I got 20, 30, 40, 50 years. I don't have to worry about this thing. Okay. What this is going to do, it's going to force you to think about it for yourself, no matter what your age. You've been surrounded by death, widespread death. It's a very happy lecture that we're talking about today. So, trying to cheer you up by talking about the Black Death. So, some people, now think about this, some people see it's God's judgment. Can you imagine why somebody would think it's God's judgment? That's where I'm pausing for you to say something.
because of the Crusades? They killed so many innocent people.
Okay, maybe punishment because of the Crusades, punishment because of sin. But what they're doing is they're equating the death of all these people that I know to God being upset with me or with Europe or with us, right? Yeah. Can you think of any diseases that we have today that some people view as God's punishment? Ebola. Well, yeah, some people might see Ebola. Yeah, it's a terrible, terrible disease. You know, the one I'm thinking about, of course, you don't hear, it's not that it's gone, but you don't hear as much about it because we have sort of controlled it. But what you used to hear a lot about would be AIDS, right? HIV, AIDS. Back when that was really sort of hitting the news, a lot of people were calling that God's judgment because it was hitting a certain population more than anybody else. Okay? So, we have similar interpretations. Some people view it as God's judgment. You see this sort of illustration here? This illustration of these guys? Notice what they have is they have little whips. And they don't have their shirts on. I don't think that's SEU approved, but they don't have their shirts on. And they're actually whipping themselves with short whips. You see that? So they would just take it and kind of do it like this. They have one in this hand and do it like this. And just keep doing it. Punishing themselves, punishing their bodies. Why? To atone for their sins, to make up for the sinful, maybe not only of themselves, but of other people. Okay? This is asceticism. The fancy word for it is asceticism. Asceticism is, at minimum, it's denying your body what you want. And it can also be sort of reversed and giving your body what it doesn't want. Okay? Now, some people this time of year practice a mild form of asceticism, right? They call it Lent. And, they give up something. It's supposed to be something you like. If you say, what I usually do is like, if I say I'm not going to eat any broccoli, that's what I give up. I'm going to give up the broccoli. I'm joking. I'm going to give up asparagus, something I don't normally eat. That's no good. I mean, that's nothing. You're giving up something you don't have. It's something you really like, you really want. You give it up, and then the idea is you do something spiritual. I mean, when you think about that thing that you would like to have, whatever it is, Snickers bar, ice cream, donuts, Coca-Cola, I don't know what it is. Then the idea is when you think, man, I'd really like to have, a Coke. Oh, I'm not supposed to have a Coke. Then you're supposed to focus on something spiritual and say, okay, I'm denying myself this, and then when I think about this, I think of all the things that Jesus, gave up, or all the things that other people less fortunate than me don't even get to have, and you turn it into something spiritual. These guys are trying to make this spiritual. They're saying, I'm going to flog my body. They're taking the verse that Paul had. You remember Paul had a verse, you can look it up. I beat my body daily into submission. There's a verse most people don't want to take literally. I beat my body daily. And they say, oh, he's speaking, metaphorically, of course. Well, they took it very literally, and that's what they're doing. Some said just the opposite. Instead of it's God's punishment, some people said it was sent by the devil. And that's a complete opposite, right? I mean, one, it has a source of God's judgment and punishment. The other one is, no, it's Satan punishing. And, they go back to Job, and they, look at all the stuff that happened to Job, the boils and all the other stuff that happened to him, everything he lost, that he's being punished or tempted, whatever, by Satan. And so we see these guys here resorting to asceticism to try to gain forgiveness. So this is one of the things, one of the reactions then has to do with what does this mean? Why is this happening to us? And you get very divergent views. It could be because, yes, we carried out the Crusades, or we did something else terrible. And God therefore is sending judgment, much like He sent the flood, or He sent, other things in the Old Testament, and that's why this happened to. And other people say, no, this is Satan. Satan sent this. Now, here's the other thing. I told you there were some cases entire cities were wiped out, or abandoned anyway. But just the opposite happens. In some areas, the plague doesn't seem to have as much effect. And people start to wonder about it. And certain parts of town aren't affected as much. And people begin to notice, for example, Jewish people are not as affected by the plague as Christians. Got any ideas why that would be? I'll just throw out some ideas. What would be possibilities? Okay, it could be a spiritual reason, right? God spared them because they're Jewish. The laws on cleanliness. Jews are a lot cleaner than Christians. I mean, just physically. Because in medieval times, most people are not bathing very often. They don't bathe at all in the winter, usually. And if you had to go down to the, if you lived in a place where the lake here would freeze over, you'd have to go down and break the ice out of the lake and give yourself a bath. Probably wouldn't do that too often. You'd probably wait till it got warm, right? If it froze over here, though, it'd give you a more fighting chance with the alligators. Slow them down a little bit, I think. Yes, so we see that the Jewish population, so some of their cleanliness, some of it might be spiritual. What's the other reason? There's another one, at least. Yeah.
They're from, a lot of them could be from the Middle East. So they could have already built up a tolerance for it.
Okay. I mean, theoretically that's true. But a lot of those Jews had lived there for a long time. I mean, they hadn't already been exposed to it. But you're right, it could be some genetic thing. I'm looking for at least one other thing, much more nefarious. They caused it, yeah. The Jews aren't getting this because the Jews are the ones doing it. Oh, this definitely was. The anti-Semitism is there. Christians start to look around and say, look at these Jews. These Jews don't get the plague. How come the Jews don't get the plague? Then the stories began. The Jews are poisoning our wells. The Jews are sneaking out at night or something, and they put something in our food, they put it in our water, and then, they just go back and they know what water or food to eat or drink, and then we get sick and die. They are causing it. It's not just they're somehow exempt from it. They're exempt from it because they're the ones causing it and they know how to avoid it. That's exactly what begins to happen. In Spain and Germany, Jews are accused of poisoning wells. And because of that, many Jews leave Western Europe and they move to Eastern Europe, to places like Poland and Russia. The plague leaves Europe in upheaval. Think about it. No matter what the cause, if you've got almost third to half the population is gone, there's a lot of fear. There's a lot of people blaming each other and so forth. Everything's in upheaval, and this also then leads to peasant rebellions. Why? Well, think about this. When the population was high, we had a lot of peasants to take care of all the work we needed to do. But when the population is lower, we got more land out there. We got the same amount of land, but we got more space out there for people to work, and we got fewer people to work. And so the peasants start to say, you know what, if you want me to work, you're going to have to pay me more. It's called supply and demand, right? If you're in a situation where you apply for a job, let's say a job, and 50 people apply for that job, only one person's going to get it. Do you think you're going to be able to go into that job demanding a lot of stuff? Saying, well, I'll take this job, if you give me a higher salary, or I'll take that job if you give me weekends off, or I'll take that job if you do this or that. No. The person hiring is going to say, you know what, you don't want this job? There are 49 other people that want it. Next. Now, do you want the job? Yeah, I'll take it. Do you have any demands? No. But what if it's reversed? What if I have 50 jobs and I only have 20 people? I have a hard time finding everybody to fill the jobs. Now suddenly you can be more demanding. We haven't had the situation in quite a while, so we're not accustomed to it, but it is true. It does happen, and that's what was happening here in Europe. You got a lot of fields that need to be planted. Well, guess what? I've been tied to this one little field my whole life. I don't want to be tied to any land anymore. I want to be a free peasant. I don't want to be a serf. You going to give me that deal? And the guy says, sure, I'll give you that deal. Or I want a bigger percentage of what when I go out here and grow this, I want a bigger percentage of what I yield is. Instead of just 20%, I want 40%. I want 50%. I want half. You own the land, you get half. I work the land, I get half. If you're really looking for workers, you might say, you know what? I'm going to take that deal because it's better for me to have all my land being worked and getting half of it than having most of my land not being worked. Therefore I get nothing. So this is what happens. Peasants begin to make demands. Peasants begin to cause rebellions because the reduced population put labor at higher demand. We still have as much land to be farmed. We still have, this hasn't affected cows and sheep and stuff, we still have a lot of animals that need to be taken care of. But we don't have as many people left to do it. All right. Anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism, of course, means you're anti-Semitic people. Semitic people are people who speak a Semitic language. Hebrew is a Semitic language. You know any other Semitic language that's pretty prevalent today in the world? I'm asking too many questions today. How about Arabic? Arabic is a Semitic language. I've never heard anyone use anti-Semitic to say you're anti-Arabs, however. So when you say anti-Semitic, they mean anti-Jewish, but technically you might say anti-Semitic means anti-someone who speaks a Semitic language, which would definitely include Arabic. But it's usually not used that way. Okay. Now, one of the things that happens about this time, I told you there's a lot of upheaval. And in England, there's a peasants' revolt. This takes place in 1381. The peasants begin to make demands. They begin to gain strength. And in fact, they begin to march on London, which of course is the main city, even at this time in England. This artwork that's here shows the king, his soldiers, during this time of the peasants' revolt. So what happens is when they move on London, the king at the time is Richard II. Richard II actually comes out and meets the people. He talks to them. He negotiates with them. And he says something, that we often hear during elections, and so forth. Promises are made. Politicians make a lot of promises. I guess other people do too. People don't always, but I hope this is not a shock to you. People don't always keep their promises. Okay. So he makes a promise. He says, you know what? I am here. I hear you, I guess is what we'd say today. I understand your problems. And I'll tell you what, though, you just really need to go home. You really need to leave. And if you leave, I promise that we will work on these situation. And as soon as they left, a little bit later, he sends his troops out to crush the rebellion. Basically, he's just buying time to. This happens. This is why people that begin trusting end up maybe not as trusting because of this kind of stuff. So this is one of the things that happens. And again, part of this is being sparked by the Black Plague or Black Death because of the peasants are now feeling like maybe they can change their situation, no longer be a serf, no longer get sort of a terrible deal on all of this, and they start making demands. Now, another thing that begins to happen about this time that we ought to mention is the 100 Years' War. By the way, if you're ever on Jeopardy, and I have had former students that have been on Jeopardy, they didn't share any of the money with me, which I don't think is fair. Although, this one guy who had been a student of mine and who was on Jeopardy, I was happy. I didn't know he was going to be on there. I didn't hardly recognize him. Then I did when they said his name and stuff. And he got a category that was ancient history. He'd been on a trip with me to the Middle East. We had seen a lot of these things. He's going down through this category. I said, you ought to know this. I know you know this. He missed a bunch of them. So, this class could put cash in your pocket. Should Alex Trebek choose you, or whoever chooses you for that show, and you answer the question, you could get a lot of these questions. And one of the questions you might get is, how long was the 100 Years' War? It's not 100 years. See? That's a trick question, because it lasts longer than 100 years. Sometimes when it says like 7 years war, it really lasts 7 years. 100 Years' War lasts longer than 100 years. It's a tricky question. I know, it's like who's buried in Grant's tomb? Grant, yes. Right. President Grant. Well, anyway, keep it in mind. And when you come into your fortune, remember your poor old professor back fighting alligators and mosquitoes in Florida. Okay. So, what happens here in the 100 Years' War? Well, remember we talked about William the Conqueror. He came from France, remember, and he went to England, and he still had land in France. This sort of sets up the basis for this. We have the King of France, and you have the Duke of Gascony. Gascony is a part of France. The King of France, King Philip VI, seizes Gascony. He takes it from the Duke of Gascony, who is Edward III, who also happens to be the King of England. See how that works? The King of France didn't like the King of England having territory in France, and so he decided he would just take the land over, kind of kick out the English Duke, who's also a king. This is what sparks the initial 100 Years' War. Now, we don't have time to go through all the details of the 100 years of this war, but we can say the key to this are foot soldiers. And this is really a change, because up to this time in medieval warfare, it has been horseback soldiers. Cavalry units have been the critical part of the battle. Foot soldiers didn't play as big a part, but now we see foot soldiers in large numbers playing a very large role in this battle. It doesn't mean they get rid of all the horses, but they do become a key to the conflict. Now, in the end, Edward wins. So remember Edward. Edward is the King of England, or the Duke of Gascony. He will win. That is, he'll keep his territory at the Battle of Crécy in 1346. But England doesn't have enough force, enough troops to be able to take all of France. So in other words, it's not like England can take over all of France. So then they keep fighting. This is why the fight goes on, because while he preserves his land, the war isn't over. They keep fighting over it. And they're fighting, and again, even though it says 100 years war, again, it doesn't mean not only that it's exactly 100 years, because it isn't, and it doesn't mean they're fighting continuously for 100 years. They fight intermittently over the next 50 years. I hate to disturb his sleep, but there she is. She's out. People, sometimes they get very tired, and they turned off, we don't have any air conditioning here because they think it's cold. Here in Florida, it's cold outside, so you don't want to turn on the air conditioning. So it gets stuffy in here. Well, anyway, they fight periodically for 50 years. Then in 1396, we have a truce. 20 years. By this time, then, a new king, Henry V, comes into power. And he says, you know what? We ought to be able to beat those French. So he renews the war. He will defeat the French in the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. And because of this, England gains even more land. They don't take all the land of France, but they gain land within France. Especially the northern part of France, they'll get more land. Okay? People are writing furiously, so I guess I better slow down. It's always good to look at the illustrations too. This is showing some of the battles, although obviously neatened up for the artwork. Well, this will then enter in someone that you probably have heard of. I call her Miss of Arc, Joan of Arc. Right? Joan of Arc enters into battle because France is really taking it on the chin. And there will be an alliance between England and the Duke of Burgundy, which is a region of France. The Duke of Burgundy decides, you know what? I don't really like the King of France anyway, so I'm going to side with England. And France is then in a weak position. England has won. There's now an alliance between Burgundy and England. A lot of England has been taken over, although not all of it. Enter then the picture Joan of Arc, as she is often called. Joan is pretty young. She's really a teenager. But Joan said that the saints said to her that she should go into battle, that she should fight, that she would lead France to victory. God was going to use her in this way. So that's what she said. She believed the saints had commanded her to free France. So what she has to do, of course, is to convince the leaders of France that this is a good idea. First of all, women aren't fighting in battle, typically, in this period. I mean, they're not in battle at all. Secondly, someone, is like 18 or 19, female, definitely not fighting in battle, right? And she has no experience. She has no training. Typically, you have soldiers that would be trained. Physical training, training how to use a sword, riding the horse in the battle. These are all things that, it's kind of tough to pick up on the job. But she convinces them, especially the king. The king is looking for any help he can get. And so she persuades the leaders in 1429. See, that should be about 17. When she joins the army and goes into battle. I mean, she rides a horse, she goes into battle. Now, when she is in the battle, France does better. Is it because Joan is, wiping out a bunch of the other people? I don't know. But her presence, I think it might be a lot of these soldiers saying, you know what, if this 17-year-old teenage girl is willing to go into battle, maybe I ought to pick it up myself, right? Maybe I've been slacking off. Maybe I've been coward. Look at her. She's brave. So when Joan is there, they fight harder. For whatever reason, they're doing better. This does not go unnoticed by the English and the French of Burgundy. They know that Joan is inspiring many victories. And in 1430, she is captured by the Burgundians. They see her in battle, they target her, they capture her, they take her alive, and they bring her and they turn her over to the English because, you see, they're allies with the English. I don't think they want to be held responsible for Joan dying or something, see? So they say, hey, we just turned them over to the English. What the English did, the English did. It's not us. Anyway, so the English then put her on trial. What were the charges against Joan? You can actually read the charges against Joan. You can read a lot about this trial if you're interested. They try her as a witch. They cite certain things from her life, like hearing these voices, which they say are demonic voices, perhaps. And also the practice that Joan had taken part in of decorating trees, which was a pagan activity at that time. And sort of dancing around a tree. It was part of tree worship, which, oaks and other trees like that, evergreen trees. We kind of have it today. We call it a Christmas tree, which we got from the Germans. And we bring the tree into our house and we sing a song to it, O Tannenbaum, and we decorate it and so forth. I'm not saying you shouldn't do that. I'm just saying that's the origin of it. And so they said she's out here doing these pagan ceremonies, dancing around a tree and decorating it. And she says she's hearing these voices. Are those voices really from God? Maybe they're not from God. Maybe they're from, Satan, the other guy, right? So, Joan is put on trial. She is convicted. She is charged with heresy. She is burned at the stake in 1431. Here's a little artistic rendering of that. They chain her to a wooden post. They put a bunch of wood around her and light it on fire. That's burning at the stake. Joan was, however, happy to find out that in 1456 all charges were dropped. So, better late than never, I suppose, but not really in time to help Joan out at the time. And she was even happier to find out that in 1920 she was named a saint by the Church, Roman Catholic Church, so she's now Saint Joan of Arc. By the way, she is connected with New Orleans, Louisiana, if you've been down that way, Nolens, and that's because she is from the town of Orleans, or Orleans. That's her hometown, and this is New Orleans. Okay. So here we see the war. We see the different areas. Primarily, a lot of that tan area was controlled by the British and the English and the Burgundians. And this green area this area down here was controlled by them. The green area was the French area. Well, the war drags on. The French finally will push the English out in 1453. And this will be the end of the war. Unified nation states across Europe emerge, and we start to see stronger and stronger national identities, national governments in places like France and England and Spain, in western part of Europe. All right, I have one more slide, so let me do this and then we'll go. This will then usher in a period called the Renaissance, and we're going to talk more about later. The Renaissance means literally a rebirth. It's a rebirth of Greco-Roman or classical ideas and thought. And in the Middle Ages, it's called the Middle because it's in the middle between the Renaissance and the classical period is this Middle Ages. But in the Middle Ages, if you take a look at the artwork and the way people thought, they were thinking about the sinfulness of humans, of themselves, and how God was glorious. During the Renaissance, the real key was The creativity and the beauty of man. Humans are the crown of God's creation, and therefore what we do should be celebrated because we are made in God's image and we are very creative and all kinds of great people. So it's just the opposite view. This Renaissance will begin about 1375 in Florence, Italy, and then move northward through Europe. It's now 1:15. We're finished. I hope you have a good day, and we'll see you later.
Did you get back to